Hey there, sports history fan. Arnie Chapman here from the Sports History Network. Now, before you jump into this episode, I wanted to share with you an exciting giveaway we have going on with Home Field Apparel. We have a digital $50 gift card to homefieldapparel.com for one lucky fan of the Sports History Network. All you got to do is head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways to sign up. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways.
Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm your co-host, Dan Newman. I'm joined, as always, by my brother and co-host, Andrew Newman. And Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, Dan. It's mid-March. We're on the verge of the NCAA tournament. Weather's been a little bit better. Let's talk about football.
So before we start, because I feel like I haven't done this in a while, I just want to remind everybody you can email the show, hellooldsports@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Hello Old Sports Podcast. You can check us out on the Sports History Network, of course, and on any podcast app you might choose. We'd encourage you to rate and review our podcast, give us a like, a follow, whatever you might find to be appropriate. Check out the other shows on the Sports History Network. And if you are looking for even more Andrew, check him out on Monday nights on his Facebook Live show, The Split Decision with Andrew Newman. So just kind of wanted to give a little rundown. I feel like we haven't done that in a while. We haven't talked about where else you can contact and find us and everything else. So just wanted to kind of do that real quick.
Yeah, and if you want to try to figure out, you can contact me at work if you'd like, but just send me a message and I'll give you that information. But only if you're in the market for some medical sutures.
Who isn't? So I think tonight's episode. So we've done a couple of episodes. We've done a couple Dark Years episodes, which is when we talked about basically the time in between championships for teams that were dynasties or near dynasties. So the first one we did was on the 70s Steelers and sort of the 20 to 15 or so years in between their last Super Bowl win and then they're going back to the Super Bowl in 1995. We did one on the Lakers, which basically covered the Lakers of the interregnum in between when Magic left and when Magic left in 91, not in 96. And then when and not when he was coach for a few days in 1993, 94, I think that was. But and then when they won the championship with Kobe and Shaq in 99 or 2000, I guess. This is a little bit different. We are talking about some very down years for a franchise, but it's with a little bit of a broader focus and not anything that ended in a championship or even a championship or, in this case, Super Bowl appearance, at least not yet. They came close this year. So, Andrew, why don't you kind of tell us what this was your brainchild. Give us a little bit of an idea about what this episode is going to be all about.
Right. And I think the thing that distinguishes this, well, two things from those dark year things we talked about is the dark year ones are kind of looking back at a down period for a franchise who was really good, had a down period, got really good again. And for the teams we're talking about, you're talking about, we talked about the Lakers, it's like a 6-7 year period. The Steelers, it was more like 15, but if we were to you think about what they call the dark ages Yankees is like 7 years in the late 60s, early 70s. Any other franchise that would be just like a normal time period. This is different because A, it takes place over a lot longer, and B, so we're talking about the Washington Redskins football team Commanders franchise. Most of what we're talking about is when they were the Redskins. So we're going to use that name probably quite a bit throughout this. It's not a commentary on the whole. We'll talk about the naming controversy, but if we're talking about the 1995 Washington team, we're going to call them the Reds. It's not a commentary on the controversy at all.
Hold on. We're not going to call them the Reds because they weren't the Reds.
I said the Redskins.
No, you said Reds, but anyway, go ahead.
No, I know what I said. Maybe you heard it differently. You're just trying to get me to say it as many times as possible. So anyway, so that's that. But full disclosure, we came up with this as an episode possibility. I came up with this as an episode possibility a year or so ago, not knowing that they were going to have this resurgence this year where they got to the NFC Championship game, had a quarterback who looks like, maybe their future franchise quarterback that they've been searching for a long time. And as we'll talk about here, they thought they found a few times. But basically what we're going to talk about, we're going to pick up the narrative in about 1992. And we're going to talk about the decline and ongoing circus of the Washington Redskins since their last Super Bowl. 1991, before we jumped in, did you have anything you wanted to mention before we got going?
No, I guess just sort of maybe just to frame it real quick. In the pre-Super Bowl era, the Redskins were one of the better teams in the NFL, but not great as far as, dynasty. I don't know how many championships. I don't have it right in front of me. 30s and 40s, they won a couple titles with Sammy Baugh as their quarterback, sort of the first great quarterback maybe in NFL history. 50s, 60s, not so good. They went to it's 69. They hire Vince Lombardi for 1 year. They start to turn it around. Unfortunately, Lombardi dies. They make a Super Bowl under George Allen, and then in the early 80s, they hire Joe Gibbs. We actually talked a little bit about Joe Gibbs when we did our random team on what would we do, the 78 Dolphins, I think, or 78 Bucks, rather, I think it was.
Yeah.
And we talked about Gibbs being an assistant for 1 year with the Bucks, an offensive assistant. And then they go on to have a really great run as one of the powerhouses of the NFC. And in fact, there's a great book by Bob Glauber, who's and I'm blanking on the name of the book, but it's a book about three sort of dominant coaches of the 80s, and that's Bill Walsh, Joe Gibbs, and Bill Parcells with the Giants. And so the Redskins from 83 to 91, they play in 4 Super Bowls. They win 3. They do something that no other team does and no other coach has done, which is win 3 Super Bowls in the course of what? I think that's 9 seasons.
10 years.
Yeah,
10 seasons.
10 seasons. 3 Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks, including one in Doug Williams, who, in additionally to being a trailblazer, is the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl.
He was a Buck before he was a Redskin.
What did I say?
You said he was a trailblazer, which doesn't make any sense for a lot of reasons.
That's like the guy who called up. We'll stop digressing here in a second, but that's like the guy who called up Mike Francesa that time, and the guy was talking about
Triple Crown.
Francesa was talking about how Mickey Mantle won the Triple Crown, and the guy just deadpan goes, "Mike, he's not a horse. That makes no sense."
Yes,
but anyway.
Go ahead, finish your thought.
And then just the other point. So, Doug Williams, who was basically a career backup in a lot of ways, especially with Washington. So really great feats. And then I think the other thing that's worth noting is that this, other than maybe Georgetown basketball, which is having its own pretty good run in the 1980s, this is the team of the Washington, D.C. area. They don't have football. They don't have baseball. They haven't had baseball in a decade. They're not going to get it for another 15 or so years. The Bullets are really not very good. The Caps are sort of a decent enough playoff team, but not a championship contender. So 80s, early 90s, the Redskins are the team in Washington, D.C.
And those other two pro teams, also to point out, don't actually play in Washington, D.C. in that time frame. They play in Maryland at the Capitol Center.
It's like the flip side of now, where the football team is the one team that doesn't play in the city right now.
And that may be a thing that changes. But a couple of things just to tell. So the book was called Guts and Genius, and the subtitle was The Story of Three Unlikely Coaches Who Came to Dominate the NFL in the 80s. And it's Bill Parcells, Bill Walsh, and Joe Gibbs. The early history of the franchise, since you mentioned, started out a couple of years in Boston. Their last year in Boston in 36, they lost in the championship game. All of the championships they made before the Super Bowl era were in a 10-year period between 36 and 45. They lost in 36 in Boston, their last year in Boston. 37, they won in Washington. They lost again in 40, and then they won in 42, lost in 43, lost in 45. So championships in 37 and 42. And then after 45, they actually didn't make the playoffs again until the 1971 season. So we mentioned the three Super Bowls, the three different quarterbacks. It's funny because the year before that in 86, the year before the 87 Super Bowl, they played the Giants in the NFC Championship game, and it was an entirely different quarterback. It was Jay Schrader, who, was a good quarterback in his own right, and Washington was one of the best teams in football that year. Where we will pick up our story is 1992. So the year after their third Super Bowl, and I know a lot of people talk about the championship teams in 87 and 82. Interestingly enough, those were both strike years. The 83 team went 14-2 and got their butts kicked by the Raiders in the Super Bowl. The 91 team you can make the argument was their best team. They went 14-2. They ran through and it's funny because of the four Super Bowls, even this is of the Bills' four Super Bowls, this seems to be the one you see the least of, because the 91 against the Giants was such a good game. And then the two Cowboy ones were those Cowboy teams. And there were so many memorable moments, especially in that first one, that you really don't see as much of those highlights, but they win and go ahead.
I think the other thing, too, is that 91 as a season in the NFC, and I think we've touched on this before, it's kind of a weird season. Dallas is a playoff team with Jimmy Johnson and, the Aikman, Smith, Irvin team, but they're still a year away. Parcells is gone from the Giants, and they're mediocre. Montana's hurt in the 90 NFC Championship game, so he's not with the Niners, and Steve Young is still sort of getting his feet underneath him. The playoffs, the NFC playoffs, are very sort of different in 1991. It's the NFC playoffs in the 91 season. Dallas is in it, and you got the Bears, but then you got the Atlanta Falcons, New Orleans Saints, Detroit Lions, three teams that barely sniffed the playoffs in most of the 1980s. You got the Giants and the 49ers on the sidelines, and you got these other teams come into prominence. So 91's kind of a weird year, the end of one era, and then right at the cusp of the 90s, when it would be all Dallas and San Francisco and later Green Bay.
So they go into 92, and we realize how many years we have to cover. Some are going to need more depth than others. We're not going to go year to year and go, like when we did those Dark Ages ones, especially with the 80s Steelers, it was like, and then after this season, Joe Green retired. We're not going to have time for all of that. But basically 92, they go in, by and large, the same cast of characters. Mark Rippon is the quarterback for the whole year. He's 30 years old. Ernest Biner is the running back. He's 30 years old. He finished 2 yards shy of 1,000, which is pretty brutal. But it's not a particularly old team. Art Monk of the skill position players is 35, so he's far and away the oldest skill position player. But he's got a lot of years left to play too. He ends up going to the Jets and maybe somewhere else to finish his career. But in general, it's the same. The same cast of characters. I'm assuming, they had that really good offensive line, which was not by 91 the Hogs, but it was still a really good offensive line. So they go 9-7. They lose to the Cowboys, the first game of the year, who obviously end up being the Super Bowl champions that year. But, as late as, 2 games left in the season, they're 9-5. They actually beat the Cowboys 20-17 in mid-December to go to 9-5. And then they fall 2 close games in a row. The last 2 games of the season, they lose in Philly 17-13, and then they lose to the Rams 21-20 in the last game of the season. And like I said, I'm not entirely positive what the exact playoff picture looked like. I'll pull that up real quick. 9-7, actually. Oh yeah, so excuse me. They got into the playoffs at 9-7. I screwed that up. I was looking at the wrong thing. So they get into the playoffs at 9-7. They're the 6th seed. They, in the first round, they go to Minnesota. They beat Minnesota. They beat up on them 24-7, actually. And then they go to San Francisco the next week.
And get smacked, right?
They lose. Well, it's 20-13. They lose. I don't know if maybe that was not as close as it appeared to be. I'm going to look at it real quick. I mean, they were down 17-3, but they cut it to 17-13 in the fourth quarter. So they obviously were in it, the whole way pretty much.
This was a Saturday night game or Saturday afternoon. I remember watching this game at home, and then we went out to Toys R Us, probably to dinner and to Toys R Us before or after. And I actually bought a Mark Rippon figure that night at Toys R Us.
With the little stand?
With the little stand with the newspaper, yeah. And I remember
we had that one in Montana.
I remember saying, like, oh, this is funny. We bought this on a day that they just lost. So
So the big news comes out of the 92 season is, I have an article here from a couple of days after the 92 season ends. And Joe Gibbs, the by far the most successful coach in franchise history and the guy who, came to define that era of Washington Redskins football. When did he take over? In 81, maybe? 81. Because I think we talked about after 78, he went to the Chargers for 2 years, and then he was the Redskins coach starting in, I think it was 81.
So they won the Super Bowl in only his second year?
I think so.
I'll look that up real quick.
You can look that up. So
I want to say a little bit also, but go ahead. Once you're done, I want to say a little bit more about the circumstances leading to his resignation.
Well, I have a Sports Illustrated article talking about his decision to retire. The lead of the article is, when Washington Redskin coach Joe Gibbs unexpectedly announced his retirement, the NFL lost a good man. Call it a burnout, stress meltdown, stop and smell the roses syndrome, or whatever you want. It snatched the 52-year-old Gibbs. And that's what I think is surprising, is he always kind of had that look, and the fact that he aged and didn't look that different 25 years later. I would have thought Joe Gibbs was a lot older than 52 in 1992. Yeah. It said, made him realize there's more to life than a 100-hour work week spent analyzing the proper deployment of the H-back. Though Gibbs admitted to having concerns about his health, something he described as migraine equivalent was depriving him of sleep. At the press conference, he said he simply wanted to spend more time with his wife, Pat, and sons, JD and Coy. And then the last part of the article reads it, but he was really getting out because his competitive nature wouldn't let him do his work at the same level. So Gibbs, the official reason was that he was going to step back and relax. He also owned a NASCAR team. And I don't know at the time that anybody knew just how involved he would be with that, but ultimately ended up being his main focus for the next decade or so.
He is having some health issues. I think he goes to the Mayo Clinic at some point. I'm not going to be able to quote much from this book because this is the end of what it covers, but it's a book called Hail to the Redskins: Gibbs, the Diesel, the Hogs, and the Glory Days of DC's Football Dynasty. It's by a guy named Adam Lazarus, who's written a few good football books, and he's had some. He had some, again, not major health issues, but he's feeling exhausted, like you said, and he's he goes to the doctor, and he's eventually, I think I saw in here somewhere that he was went to the Mayo Clinic, and he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So yeah, he's not in great shape, as as you alluded to, working those hours for all those years could lead to a person not feeling so great.
So he leaves, and again, you still have to remember this is the Washington Redskins. This was a marquee NFL job. It was in what still probably is, but certainly then had the prestige of being the biggest division in football. Mm-hmm. It was a team that had just won the Super Bowl a year prior. And I believe at this time, and lasted for quite a while. And when we talk about a guy who's going to be a big figure in this episode, the fact that he managed to screw this up is saying something. But this was also like the biggest money team in the NFL at the time. Now, the Cowboys were obviously coming on, but for years they would put out these things that showed that the Redskins were the most profitable team in the NFL.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but I also think that DC culture was different 30 or so years ago, and you had a lot more members of Congress, senators who really made their home in DC, as opposed to now when, because of a variety of reasons, they spend less time in DC, especially on the weekends. So the Redskins were sort of not only did they have a fan base that stretched from, because keep in mind, there's been no Colts for 10 years. They got a fan base that stretches from Baltimore all the way to Richmond, Virginia, maybe even further down, because there's no Carolina Panthers. The Falcons are around, but not great. So they're basically, the team of the Mid-Atlantic in a lot of ways. Plus, they're the team of official Washington, cabinet members, senators, congressmen, that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of reasons, but they're worth a lot in those days.
So 93 is pretty much an unmitigated disaster for them. They hire Richie Pettibon, who I believe had been an assistant for Gibbs for a long time.
I think pretty much the whole time that he was there. Yeah.
So again, and you see this sometimes where, to try to keep the train rolling, and I don't know how much of a hand Gibbs had in this. I don't want to, if I don't know, I don't want to say, but like, sometimes you see this where it's like, well, we've had all this success and the coach is leaving. Let's just promote the guy who's his top assistant and plug him in there and try to change as little as possible. And there's a lot more examples of that not working than there is examples of it working.
Well, especially when you don't make a lot of changes to the personnel. And that's what the Packers did with Phil Bankston. That's what the Giants did with Ray Handley. The only one where I can think of it really sort of working, and maybe there's other examples too, but that's what the Niners did the same thing with Seifert, but when you have Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, and Jerry Rice, you're maybe in a little bit better shape. One more thing about Richie Pettibon. I just should mention this. This is kind of funny. His family owns an alarm company still. It's called I think it's called Pettibon Alarm. Every once in a while when I'm driving around here, and I live in the, sort of the Annapolis area, every once in a while I'll see one of their trucks, and it's here it is. Here's the logo. Pettibon Alarm Company, and then it's a little picture of a football, and it says, "Defense is a family tradition." So
So they end up, and this was the year that this is looking at the sort of the transactions. It stands as a Giant fan because this was the year Carl Banks was brought into to the Redskins. They really, really struggle. And it's funny, they beat the Cowboys badly in week 1. The Cowboys who had won the Super Bowl would go on to win the Super Bowl. The Cowboys or the Redskins beat them badly in week 1. I believe that was when Emmitt Smith was holding out. But after that, they lose 6 games in a row. They fall to 1-6. They, never get above that. I mean, it's not like they build anything up after that. They end up finishing the year 4-12. It's got to be their worst season since, they couldn't have had that bad a season at any point in the 80s, I wouldn't think.
I don't think so, no. They were pretty perennial.
Mm-hmm. They also have a ton of injuries. Rippon only makes 10 starts. Their two starts are made by a guy named Kerry Conklin, who I've never heard of, and 4 starts are made by Rich Gannon, the young quarterback who had previously been, I want to say, in
Minnesota, yeah.
Minnesota for a few years. He's with Washington for 1 year. He gets hurt, doesn't play at all in 1994, moves on, and ultimately, has a few great years with the Raiders, wins an MVP, gets him to a Super Bowl. But, the Redskins, they have this really bad year in the first year of the Post-Gibbs era. And as would be characteristic for them later on, they decide that Richie Pettibon is over his head, is not cut out to be a head coach, that the results in one season are not acceptable, and they go out and make a big splash. And, certainly this guy's become, he's not known as a long-time successful NFL coach, but at the time, this was considered a very smart hire. And heading into the 1994 season, they go out and they sign Norv Turner to be their head coach.
Norv Turner, who had been the offensive coordinator in Dallas with Jimmy Johnson and had just won 2 Super Bowls. It's also funny to think, and I have to admit, I do not know sort of the cadence of how this worked, but I wonder, maybe I can look this up real quick. I wonder if there was talk of giving Turner the job when Jimmy Johnson left. I wonder how that all played out. I'm sure, my guess is that Turner would have been Jimmy Johnson's chosen successor, but I don't know. I don't know what the order of all that was, or if it was something that the Cowboys were ever even able to consider. It's possible Turner had taken the Redskin job before the Super Bowl was even played.
Yeah, this article I see here is dated February 2nd of 94, so would not have been very long after the Super Bowl. Obviously, that was when it was still played in January. I have an article here from the Roanoke Times, but this was the one thing that's a problem with researching this article is the main paper you're going to pull up is the Washington Post, and the Washington Post is paywalled. Yeah. So a lot of stuff. I'm not looking for this for like current political news. I'm trying to find an article from 1995 about Norv Turner. But so this is why I have some of these articles from, it's probably like an AP article or something, but the link I have is from the Roanoke Times. And it's about Turner being hired. He was 41 years old. Another guy who you have a hard time imagining was ever not 58 or 60 years old. Had been with the Cowboys for 3 seasons. At 4:50, Cook emerged from Redskin Park and began to get into the green Jaguar, driven by his son. Asked her whether he'd hired a new coach. Cook smiled coyly and said, "Greetings and good night to all." And then climbed in. Go ahead.
A few things. First of all, when you say Cook, you're talking about Jack Kent Cook, who was the longtime owner of the team and had previously owned a lot of teams, but he'd owned the Lakers in the 70s. He was actually the guy who drafted Magic Johnson. He was just sort of preparing to sell the team to Jerry Buss, but he was actually the guy who sold the team to Magic Johnson. I think who else? He owned other teams too. He owned the LA Kings for a while, and did he own the Rams? No, he never owned the Rams. But he owned the Redskins, he owned the Lakers in the 70s, and I think he owned the LA Kings around the same time.
By the way, I have a way to clear this up. Later in this article, it says, I think Norv will be an outstanding coach, Dallas coach Jimmy Johnson said. So he was obviously still being referred to as the Dallas coach when Norv Turner was taking the Redskin job.
Johnson didn't leave the Cowboys until late March, which kind of tracks with my vague memories, the whole thing. The other thing I would say, you said it's probably an AP article. Don't be surprised if in 1994 that newspaper in Roanoke had a full-time Redskins beat reporter. I would not be surprised. So
yeah, you're probably right. It's all Crockett country. So the 94 season does not, it actually gets worse from a record standpoint from 4-12. They finished 3-13 in 94. Their wins are well spaced out. They win their second game of the year, then they win their 8th game of the year, and then they have a nice 7-game losing streak, and then they win their final game of the year against the LA Rams in what may have been the Rams' last game in Los Angeles, because I think 95 was their first year in St. Louis, but that's neither here nor there.
And by this point, it's basically, with the exception of Darrell Green, who is the all-time great cornerback, who's 34 years of age in the 1994 season. Darrell Green actually ends up playing 20 full seasons with the Redskins, all the way from 83 to 2002. He's the fastest guy in the NFL, well into his late 30s. And the guy plays 16 games in 1983 as a 23-year-old rookie. He plays 16 games in 2002 as a 42-year-old, 20-year veteran. I think he's like one of only like 3 guys to spend 20 years with the same NFL team. And Brady, Brady, I guess, technically did if you count the year he was a backup. But there's like a very, very small number of guys who've done that. All-time great, classy guy. He's really the only one left from the kind of I'm sure there are a few other players still hanging around that were on the team in 91, because after all, it's only 3 years later. But most of the guys, the Art Monks, the Rippins, a lot of those linemen, Russ Grimm, that kind of guy, most of those guys are gone by 94.
And in 94, they have 3 different starting quarterbacks. 2 of them are rookies. One of them is John Freeze, who I remember with Seattle years later. But the 2 rookie quarterbacks they have are Heath Shuler and Gus Frerotte. Heath Shuler was picked with the 3rd overall pick. So, obviously he was the one they were counting on being, and you're right. You look at some of the skill position players and a couple of names jump out at you, but unfortunately for them, as guys who went on to pretty successful careers or pretty notable careers with other teams. Desmond Howard on here at 24 years old, Frank Wycheck at 23 years old. Both of them would see some measures of success and some famous postseason plays, but long after they were gone from Washington. So the bottom falls out again in 94. They're 3-13. 95, they go 6-10. It's really more of the same. And the reason I'm not zooming through, but the reason I'm kind of going through these ones a little quicker is we start to get into some sort of momentous occasions the next few years. But, 95, again, Frerotte is now the mostly full-time starter, but Shuler is also starting for them a little, but nothing really significant to mention on really either of these teams. North Turner's now been the coach a couple of years. 3-13, 6-10, but, he's getting some. They're being patient with him, I guess, understanding that he's there to really rebuild the team.
Yeah, that's just crazy to me. You'd never see that in the NFL today. And we're talking about something from the 90s here. But yeah, 3-13, 6-10, 9-7 in 96, but they don't make the playoffs. 97, 8-7-1, still don't make the playoffs, right? No. So 4 years in a row. Or no, wait, hold on. Is it how many years in a row without a playoff? They must have one in here somewhere. Do they
think they get in 99, maybe?
They got to get in before that. They really let him go 5 years without a playoff berth? 94, 4-12. 95, 6-10. They obviously don't make it that year. 96, 9-7. No. 97, 8-7-1. No. 98. So 5 years in a row they don't make the playoffs, and he still holds on to his job. You're probably going to get into this in a minute, but I wonder if the ownership turmoil with Cook dying and everything maybe played a role in that. But God almighty, really in any era of football, 5 years without the playoffs in a row, you don't keep your job.
So 96 is an interesting year for a couple of reasons. We'll do the team itself first. They lose in week 1 to Philadelphia, 17-14, and then they win 7 games in a row in 96. They rattle off wins against the Bears, Giants, Rams, Jets, Patriots, Giants again, Colts, and then they're 7-1. They lose a couple in a row. They beat Philadelphia. They're 8-3 with a month left in the season, and then they lose 4 games in a row to San Francisco in overtime, Dallas, Tampa Bay, and Arizona to get to 8-7. And I believe by that point they're out of playoff contention going into their last game of the season, which we'll talk about in a second. But they, well, interestingly enough, the 9-7 was good enough for the last playoff spot that ultimately went to Minnesota. But so they must have had the tiebreaker over Washington. But to start 7-1 and then not make the playoffs is quite the collapse.
They get a career year in 1996 from a guy who I remember. Terry Allen was his name. He started his career with the Vikings, and then after missing, missed a season, went back to the Vikings, and then played a few years with the Redskins. 1,353 yards rushing, leads the league with 21 rushing touchdowns, which is really, really good in any era. And yeah, they're better, but not good enough to make the playoffs yet.
So right now I'm going to go back to 1990, and this will make sense in a minute. And this is a Post article from 1990, and the beginning of the article reads, Washington Redskins owner Jack Kent Cooke and the District of Columbia Armory Board have all but finalized an agreement for a new football stadium that will keep the Redskins in the District of Columbia, sources said late Friday. Conceptually, that deal has been worked out. So as early as 1990, there is no letter of agreement, another source said, but, as early as 1990, probably earlier if they're working out a tentative deal in 1990, the Redskins are looking to build a new stadium. They've been at RFK Stadium since, what the hell year?
61.
Since 61, when RFK Stadium basically opened with the new Senators, right?
Yeah, 61, and then the Senators started playing there in 62. In fact, I don't know a lot about this, but I think one of the Redskins, the last team to integrate, and one of the sort of conditions that the federal government put on building the new stadium that would eventually become RFK was that the Redskins would have to integrate. I don't know the whole story. If you're listening to this and you know the story, you know what I'm talking about, and you probably, and others would know a lot more about this, but that was part of the push to open that stadium in the early 60s, with the Redskins would have to finally integrate.
So, like a lot of stadiums, and I never was at RFK. I've been by it. It was still standing, and I think DC United was still playing there when I was living there. The Nationals had just moved to Nationals Park. So I probably should have taken the opportunity to go. But
I went to a couple Nats games there in 06 and 07. It was a fun place. It was fun knowing all the football history that was there.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the, like when I went to the Oakland Coliseum this year for the last year, the A's were open. Baseball there too, but also thinking about all the games the Raiders played there. So, like a lot of stadiums, it's the fans love it, and it's certainly, it doesn't have the problems of, say, like a Cleveland Browns, the Memorial Stadium or something like that, where you can visibly see chunks of cement falling down. But, and again, we're talking about the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Luxury boxes are starting to become a big thing, especially with a team, like you said, that's got that big DC government connection. And that's not just, will a senator go to a game? It's also, I'm sure lobbying firms that are willing to pay big money to take people and do things like that. So,
and that's become much more of a thing than it was 15, 20 years earlier also.
Yeah. And this is, the reason I want to hammer home the time frame on this is there is plenty to blame the next guy about, even specific to the stadium. But I think sometimes people think this was him, and it wasn't. It wasn't Daniel Snyder that moved them to that stadium.
No, in fact, the stadium opened before he bought the team.
That's what I'm saying. So again, we'll get to him. But so that, they're looking to move out in the 90s. And I believe in 1990, they signed their original lease was up. It was probably a 30-year lease. And they came to an agreement to continue playing there, for the foreseeable future. And I don't have all the details on why that agreement from 1990 fell apart. Probably the same reason a lot of things do, the revenue for it, the tax situation. I'm sure things are much more complicated when it comes to Washington, D.C., with the influence of the federal government over the city itself, or the control by the federal government over the city's finances. So I don't know exactly what happened, but basically by 1996, they have announced that not only are they moving out of RFK Stadium, they are moving out of the District of Columbia and into Landover, Maryland, out into a suburban area, and they will be leaving Washington, D.C., which they've called home since the 30s.
Yeah, and it's not crazy, especially in the NFL, for teams to be out there. I mean, the Metrodome that the Vikings play in for, well into the 21st century is not in Minneapolis, I don't believe. And
I think the Metrodome was in Minneapolis. The Silverdome was not in Detroit.
Wasn't the Metrodome in Bloomington, I want to say? I think
I will
was.
check. But I mean, just to underscore it, 3 of the 4 teams in the NFC East don't play in the city they have listed there. The Cowboys haven't played in Dallas in 50 years or 40 years, whatever. The Giants have played in New Jersey for 40 years. Them moving out of DC, had it not really coincided or roughly coincided with the collapse of the franchise, I don't think would be regarded as this big problem. It's the fact that the two things happened at the same time.
Well, the other 2 things I would mention is that, I've lived in the DC area for pretty much my whole adult life. There's not a lot of places to put a football stadium in Washington, DC. It's not like other cities. And second of all, they're not all that far away. I mean, they're on the metro system. It's not, that stadium is closer to DC than my house is, and I commute in every day. So it's not like this isn't like a team. This isn't like the 49ers moving to Santa Clara 10 years ago. They're still in the basic area.
Mm-hmm. So, but again, it's always going to be a little bit of a thing when your team is moving into a new stadium and moving out of, the area they specifically represent. So 1996, last year at RFK Stadium, it starts out looking like it's going to be a special year. By the middle of the year, it's looking really, really good. By the end of the year, it's looking really, really bad. But they have one last hurrah at RFK Stadium in 1996, where they play and defeat their arch rival Dallas Cowboys the last game of the year. And I mean, I don't know if the game particularly meant anything to the Cowboys. I would have to look at that, but they end up beating the crap out of the Cowboys in that game. One last game at RFK Stadium. I tend to get this one confused with, I think the last NFL on CBS game that like Madden and Summerall did was also at RFK Stadium in 92. That would have been, right?
Yeah.
So for years in my head, I had it that that was the same game. So like I thought they left a lot earlier than they did, but they obviously didn't.
Yeah.
Wade Wilson started this game for the Cowboys, so it obviously didn't. I don't know if he started the game. He played most of the game. The leading rusher in the game for the Cowboys was Sherman Williams.
I remember Sherman Williams. Yeah.
So it was not the Cowboys did not exactly play their A team in this game, but so an entirely new era of Redskins football is about to start. 1996 into 1997 was already going to be this momentous shift. And then that offseason, April of 97, the owner, the longtime owner of the Redskins, like you mentioned, previous owner of the Lakers, Sand Dobbs enjoyer, Jack Kent Cook, passes away. At first, the franchise goes to his estate, his heirs, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they enter a new stadium in 1997 with a new, I guess, owner, or really the absence of their previous owner, for the first time in decades.
Yeah, and they're still not doing much winning on the field.
So the stadium they're playing in is called Jack Kent Cook Stadium in 1997. This year is actually, it's better. They finished 8-7-1. The one we'll have to talk about, not to overly get into our focus, but it's also the most, it's certainly, actually, before we do that, let's talk about Jack Kent Cook, because I have the obituary from the day he dies. The article said, in place of politicians, lawyers, and bureaucrats, mostly painted various shades of gray, Jack Kent Cook stood out like the Washington Monument. One reason was his ownership of the Washington Redskins football team, the one successful and universally loved institution in a city riven by failure and racial segregation. So we're really getting into it in this article. More important, though, he brought unpredictability, flamboyance, and excitement. 84 years, born in Canada, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a whole article on him. He had owned a 25% share in the Redskins. He took them over in the mid 70s and became the sole owner. So he passes away. Like we mentioned, they opened the new stadium. The 97, the game I wanted to mention. So, they're decent enough. They're 8-7 or 8-7-1. There is a Monday Night Football game. The game they end up tying. And I was at a Giants Redskins, or I guess they were the Commanders that year, a couple of years ago. Maybe they were the Washington football team tie at MetLife Stadium in 2022, and it brought back memories of this game. It was late November of 1997. I believe it was a Monday Night Football game, and they end up tying, but this game is famous as the Gus Frerotte headbutt game. Yes. In this game,
this was a Sunday night game.
Sunday night. Okay. In this game, when the Giants, who were a surprising 7-4 going into this game, Washington was 6-5, so just behind them. It ends up tied 7-7. In the second quarter, Gus Frerotte has a 1-yard touchdown run, and after he scores, he runs over to the padded wall at the back of the end zone and slams his helmet, his head into the wall. He's still wearing his helmet, but gives himself a concussion, has to leave the game. You remember who he gave way to in that game?
I was just about to say the same thing to you, Jeff Hostetler.
It would have been funny if after Frerotte headbutted the wall, if they said Frerotte is down and getting up slowly. Now we'll get Jeff Hostetler. So Jeff Hostetler, former Giant Super Bowl winning quarterback, comes in. The game ends 7-7. Washington ends up, not making the playoffs. They lose 2 of their last 4 after that. They lose to the Rams. They lose to the Giants in the second to last game of the season at Giant Stadium a couple of weeks later. So they end up missing the playoffs, but they finished with a winning record for the first time since, must have been 92, right? 96.
They were 9-7 in 96. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So they finish out of the money, but they finished with a winning record. They're in their new stadium, but sort of the turmoil that is hanging over the entire year is the estate of Jack Kent Cook owns this team. I think for a time there's a thought that they might be able to, and for a couple of years now, the estate of Jack Kent Cook limps along as the owner of the team.
Yeah,
so
I'm looking at the Football Reference site. I'm looking at the 98 team, and it usually says, stadium, general manager, owner, and then here it's executor of the estate of Jack Kent Cooke, and then it lists 7 different people. I don't know if those are all his kids or relatives or what the deal is there, but yeah, there's not a supreme commander at the top.
No. So 98 gets again strange. They start 0-7. They have it's almost the reverse of that 96 season where they were 7-1. In 98, they start 0-7. They finish 6-10. Their primary starter is now Trent Green, who would be shortly on his way to St. Louis. I think where was he before that? He was a 27-year-old rookie.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that history, but yeah, 97 was his first year. Where did Trent Green go to college? He went to college at Indiana. Let me see. Look at his college stats here. You keep talking. I gotta go down a rabbit hole of Trent Green because his last year at Indiana was 1992.
All right, and so there was, where would he have played too? The USFL was gone.
I'm gonna look that up.
So the 1998 team is also a team that spent a lot of money on defense to bring guys in. They made 2 real big free agent splashes, and neither particularly worked out, but they acquired Dana Stubblefield, who had previously been on the 49ers, and they acquired Dan Wilkinson, who had previously been on the Cincinnati Bengals. And Stubblefield, at least, was a big name and a guy who'd been on high-profile 49ers teams, although they gave him a lot of money and it was a failure because he really didn't, do anything with Washington. Wilkinson was a guy who, was not super good to begin with, and they gave him big money because they wanted to have a superstar, so they paid him like a superstar, and just, sort of the beginning of spending a lot of money on free agent acquisitions that did not pan out.
Trent Green, by the way, played a year in the CFL after his college career, and then was basically with the Redskins. He just never got in a game for 4 years or whatever.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. And it's not like they had great quarterback play that time. It was guys like Barat and Heath Schuler and all of that. So, they start to have some interesting names on this team. This is when Michael Westbrook is on the team, who ultimately ended up
having some good years with Philly.
I think you're thinking of Brian Westbrook.
Oh.
In August of 97, the Redskins fined Westbrook $50,000 for punching a teammate, running back Stephen Davis, an incident caught on TV news cameras. So, okay. He eventually got into mixed martial arts, so he was obviously just ahead of his time. 98, they, again, are not anything special. They finished 6-10. They don't qualify for the playoffs. They now have missed the playoffs every year since Joe Gibbs has left. Or no, I keep forgetting. The 1 year they got in 90.
No,
90. Yeah, 92. Yeah, all right.
That was Gibbs' last year.
That's right.
That's what I was saying. Turner, 5 years in a row without a playoff experience, and they still don't fire him.
Mm-hmm. So in the offseason between 98 and 99 is when Daniel Snyder takes over the team. He spends $800 million for the team and the stadium. He had been known as where did he make a lot of his money? He was was he an executive at FedEx? Is that how he made his money, or was that?
I don't know that. I'll look that up real quick.
Became the youngest CEO of a New York Stock Exchange listed company, top investors. Yeah, see what you can find on that. So he takes over in May of 99. He buys the team from Jack Kent Cooke's estate. It was the most expensive transaction in sporting history. Deal was financed largely through borrowed money, including $340 million borrowed from Societe Generale and 155 million of debt assumed on the stadium, et cetera, et cetera.
So let me caveat that this is Wikipedia, so I don't know that it's 100% true, but it's in there. His company, Snyder Communications, is an advertising community. In 1992, the company expanded into telemarketing with a focus on the immigrant market, which, I don't know, kind of sounds vaguely to me like they're trying to scam people who don't speak English. So, I don't know, but wouldn't surprise me.
And, we're not going to necessarily have time to go through all of these in the exact chronological order they came in. So let's talk about him now. He is largely considered to be, would you say he's the worst owner in modern professional sports history?
It's really hard for me to say. Even though I live in DC, there were a lot of times I just kind of tuned all of it out. I mean, for an NFL team to lose that much after having been so good, but I don't know. It's hard to say because a lot of the scandal were things that were kind of off the field, but they were never sort of a rock bottom disaster. They had their moments, but it wasn't like they were a perennial 2-win team. They had these sort of, ups and downs. I know that, and we can talk about this when we get to it. I know that he clashed with coaches a lot, including some really good coaches, but I don't know. That's a hard thing to quantify for me.
Yeah, so he was incredibly combative and thin-skinned and kind of all of the worst things people talk about with George Steinbrenner, minus the part where the team actually won. There's an article that's risen to legendary proportions because I believe Snyder sued the writer of it, sued the newspaper, tried to do all of these things to wield his power against all of this. But Dave McKenna wrote an article in November 19th of 2010 called for Washington City paper called "The Cranky Redskins Fans Guide to Dan Snyder," and it's an A to Z thing. And like I said, this got legendary, and I'll look up the exact details. But he basically goes through like 0 to 9 and then A to Z. So like, it just has like one is $20 price. Snyder affixed to Redskins Mania, the first Redskins scratch lottery ticket, making it as expensive as any scratcher ever offered by the Virginia Lottery. Trying to bankrupt airline peanuts. What Snyder was selling to fans at FedEx Field.
I was going to bring this up later.
During the 2006 season, vendors offered shelled nuts in royal blue and white 5-ounce bags adorned with the Independence Air logo. The airline had gone under about a year earlier. So, just that kind of stuff. He'd been at Six Flags. That's where I think he got a lot of his money, where he'd kind of risen to prominence. He became didn't he end up owning like every radio station, like every talk radio station in the DC area, and then essentially not allowing anybody who had a history of being critical of the Redskins to have shows on there?
That sounds familiar. Yeah, that does sound very familiar.
Yeah, so anyway, there's a lot you can get into, and some of it is just him being a billionaire that seemed to be very unlikable, and then some of it will come up sort of naturally as we talk to some of these stories, but he is some of this is just incredibly, like, it's not really worth talking about here, but just seemed to be willing to slap the Redskins logo on pretty much everything. I see a Redskins extra point MasterCard. This is the kind of thing. This is the kind of thing that I think really sums him up, and he's not alone in this, but the Redskins extra points MasterCard, the only credit card Snyder told fans he'd accept for season ticket payments for the 2005 season. So basically, he said you have to have a Redskins Extra Points MasterCard to buy season tickets because those are the only cards we'll accept.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. First of all, you wonder if a guy whose background was somewhat in telemarketing and amusements is used to looking, even by NFL owners. Look, you go to any professional sport, let alone the NFL, they're trying to, they're trying to turn you over, hold you by your ankles, and shake out the change in your pockets. It's like when they came up with their bag policy, whatever, many years ago, and you have to bring this, you can't bring in a bag, you can't bring in this, and they say it's about security. It's like, no, they want you to buy every damn thing you possibly would need to buy at the stadium. So any NFL owner is like that to a certain degree in the modern era, but it sounds like Snyder was particularly, it's like, couldn't just, it's like you hear about you hear about like some of these old wrestlers, or, the way Howard Stern used to rant about some of his, fellow competitors who would just slap their name on anything. It's like, you can pass a couple of these up just to not seem like you're running some sort of a 2-bit scam.
Yeah. And there's definitely certain cable channels that you look and it's like, you can tell the level of respect for their audience that they have when they're constantly trying to sell them stuff. So I found the full article. Basically, he insisted that the paper fire Dave McKenna for writing that article, and then he accused them of being anti-Semitic. Use, I guess, some of the artwork in the thing he considered to be, attacking him because of his faith. So, anyway, just that kind of thing. But to get back to sort of the chronology. So 1999 is actually a very interesting season for them because it's the first year with Dan Snyder as the owner. And for the first time, they are a playoff team. The first time in almost a decade, they're a playoff team. Norv Turner, who had gotten quite a lot of rope to finally make a playoff appearance, gets them into the playoffs at 10-6. They win their division. They actually win a playoff game. They win the wild card game against Detroit, 27-13, before ultimately falling just 14-13 to Tampa Bay. So they were actually pretty close to getting to the NFC Championship game that year. The quarterback on this team is Brad Johnson, who I believe this is his only year with Washington, or maybe one other year. But Johnson is the quarterback. He throws for 4,000 yards and 24 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. They also drafted Champ Bailey.
They got this. This is crazy. They got 2 future Hall of Fame quarterbacks. One is 21 in Champ Bailey, and one is 39 in Darryl Green.
And I believe this was also, let me see their actual. So this was also the year that they basically got everybody. They got the Saints' entire draft. So
the Ricky Williams trade.
The Saints got the first pick of the 5th overall pick of the draft from the Redskins and took Ricky Williams. Washington ended up with the 12th overall pick, which they used, and they ended up drafting. You want to talk about one of the things that really hurt them for a couple of years here. Here is everybody they got from all of these picks they got from New Orleans and the player they selected. 1999 first round pick, 12th overall, Cade McNown. 1999 third round pick, 71st overall. They traded to Chicago. 99 fourth round pick, Nate Stimson. 1999 fifth round pick, later traded to Chicago. 1999 sixth round pick, traded to Denver. 1999 seventh round pick, traded to Denver. 2000 first round pick, second overall, they took LeVar Arrington, who turned into a really good player.
Yeah.
And 2000 third round pick, Lloyd Harrison. So they ended up spinning a bunch of these into other trades, and that Denver trade we'll talk about later. But, they didn't end up, when you get a haul of picks like that and then don't really do a whole lot with it, it's a little bit, it ends up being a little bit of a wasted opportunity. Not that they would have been in better shape if they'd taken Ricky Williams, but they could have done a better job with all those picks they got.
No, you wanted that to be like a Herschel Walker type thing.
Yeah, set up your dynasty for the future.
Yeah.
So, but they do draft Champ Bailey. Let me see. I feel like there might have been one other significant pick here. Let me see if I can find that. They also took John Jansen, who ended up being a Pro Bowler, an offensive tackle on the team, and Jeff Hall in the 6th round, who ended up being a pretty good kicker for them. So, the reviews through 1 year would have been, they have a quarterback who led them to the playoffs. They have a, potential stud in Champ Bailey on the team. The owner seems to be committed to winning. The arrow seemed to be in 1999. And by 1999, it was obvious also that the Cowboys thing was over. So for the first time in the better part of a decade, the division is also a little bit, the division is in play again. And I know the Giants won the division in 97, but the 90s from 92 on had been dominated by the Dallas Cowboys in the NFC East.
And they've hit rock bottom by the late 90s.
Yeah, they're in the Dave Campo era or whoever was before Dave Campo.
Yeah.
So yeah, they are very much, I think 99 might have been the year that Aikman got hurt, and that was the end of his career and that kind of thing. So that's where they are as they head into 2000. And Brad Johnson also looks like he could be the quarterback of the future for them.
Which makes one of their off-season moves a little puzzling.
So they go into 2000, and this was the Jeff George thing. Am I right about that?
Yeah, they bring in Jeff George as a free agent, I think. I think they bring him in as a free agent. He'd been kind of bouncing around. They also bring in Bruce Smith, Hall of Fame defensive end who's at the back end of his career. They signed Deion Sanders to a 7-year, $56 million deal. Deion Sanders, who's no spring chicken himself. And they draft Arrington, like you said. So things are maybe kind of sort of looking up a little bit.
That Deion thing led a few years later to one of my favorite, when Jimmy Kimmel was still doing the Fox NFL. So Deion played this year with the Redskins. He was not good. He retires. He goes back. He does the NFL on CBS. And then in 2003, they're talking about him going to the Ravens.
Oh, you're missing something, though.
What am I missing? He'll play baseball again?
He played baseball again in 2001 for the Reds.
So in 2003, I think he ultimately ended up going back. But in 2003, there was rumors he was going to go back to the Ravens.
And he played for the Ravens, yeah.
Yeah, he did. But there was rumors that it was going to happen. He was still on CBS on the pregame show. And Jimmy Kimmel was doing the thing he invented that ended up becoming Frank Caliendo and whatever on the Fox NFL Sunday show. And he's like, yeah, there's rumors that Deion Sanders might join the Ravens. Now, if you'll remember, the last time we saw Deion on the field, he was a below average player on a bad team. If you turn the channel right now, you'll see that's still the case. And, it was just very for the time, it was one of those ooh, it's almost like when you'd see a wrestler make a behind the scenes comment. You're like, ooh, you don't see much of that. It was like that, him making that comment. But
it is
so 2000.
It is worth pointing out now that this year they actually now have 3 future Hall of Fame cornerbacks in Champ Bailey, Deion Sanders, and Darryl Green.
So they go into the 2000 season, and they won the division the year before, and I think a lot of people thought they might be a championship level contender in 2000. And before the season, Daniel Snyder was asked during training camp how long Norv Turner would be the coach, and he said a long time. Turner would not make it through the season. It would be the first Daniel Snyder coach firing. They start out 6-2. They are tied for first in the division with the Giants. They start to go on a real slide where they lose 5 out of 6 games. By the time they fall to 7-6 after they lose to the Giants on December the 3rd in a 9-7 game, good Lord, Norv Turner is fired by Dan Snyder, who just earlier in the just earlier in that season in training camp had said that Norv Turner would be the coach for a long time. He fires him at 7-6 when they still have a chance to make the playoffs. Terry Robisky comes in and coaches the last 3 games of the year.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Real quick, I'm taking this from a really good ESPN timeline that came out a couple years ago of the Snyder years. Apparently, Snyder wanted to hire as interim coach former UCLA coach named Pepper Rogers, who was 69 and was a confidant of Snyder. The assistants all threatened to quit, and so he ends up giving it to Terry Robisky instead.
Let me see if I can. I thought when I searched Pepper Rogers, or when I was looking through this McKenna article before, I saw the name Pepper Rogers. Let me see if I can find what he had to say about that. The Pentagon flag hat, which is, I'm sure, FedEx official. He was a FedEx official. It says FedEx official who Snyder almost made Redskins head coach. Snyder knew he wanted to fire Turner, so he contemplated Rogers, who never coached in the NFL and whose last coaching stint was with the Memphis Mad Dogs of the CFL. Rogers' main qualification was the Redskins job that after FedEx became a Redskins sponsor, he watched games with Snyder in the owner's box and told stories about coaching John Riggins at the University of Kansas. So that was that was his apparent qualifications to be the job, the head coach. Go ahead.
He also wrote a novel in 1985 that is a fictionalized and bawdy account of his experience as a college football coach and recruiter.
Good Lord. All right. So they go into 2001 and they got a new head coach. It's Marty Schottenheimer. And I remember how this year had shaken out, because now we start to get into the years I remember. They had been, if in 2000 they were predicted to be one of the best teams in the NFL, in 2001 they were supposed to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. I remember going into the season, people saying they were going to be, horrible. It was going to be a long slog for Marty Schottenheimer to rebuild this team. Tony Banks was going to be the quarterback. Jeff George was gone and Brad Johnson was gone. So Tony Banks was going to be the starter. The other 2 quarterbacks on that team were Kent Graham and Sage Rosenfels. And
Kent Graham, the ex-Giant.
Yes. And they do start 0-5, but they turn it around and they finish 8-8. And I don't know. They didn't make the playoffs, but I don't know if they missed the playoffs by that much. They were 0-5, then they were 5-5, and then 6-8. They won their last 2 games against New Orleans and Arizona to get to 8-8, and I think just missed the playoffs.
Let's check that out real quick. 2001, they're 8-8. They're second in the NFC East to, who would that have been? Dallas that year? No, Philly, obviously. Bucks make it at 9-7. So yeah, they're only, I don't know whether they were in it or not going into the last week, but the Bucks are only a game better. So yeah, you're probably right.
So after, a year and change of Norv Turner under his watch, and then he brings in Marty Schottenheimer, expecting this to be a long rebuild. They lose their first 5. They finish 8-5. But Marty Schottenheimer's got his eye on a new toy. Daniel Snyder's got his eye on a new toy and a new strategy that's he hopes to win football games, but he knows going to get him headlines. And out goes Marty Schottenheimer after 1 year. And in comes the old ball coach, Steve Spurrier from the University of Florida.
On the issue, on the way out, Schottenheimer says, quote, "The issue we could not resolve was the process of selecting players to make up the Washington Redskins roster."
And I have an article here from ESPN page 2. The link actually still brings up the old style ESPN, not page 2, just ESPN NFL.
We're looking at the same article.
Joe Theismann?
No, maybe not.
This article's written by Joe Theismann.
It's written by Joe Theismann?
Yeah, he wrote articles for ESPN back then.
Did
He was on
really?
ESPN. So
yeah, I mean, no, my article is not written by Joe Theismann.
So the articles, and I mean, Joe Theismann can be a grating guy, but he said, taking nothing away from Steve Spurrier and his coaching ability, Washington Redskins owner Dan Snyder should not have fired Marty Schottenheimer. Getting the Redskins 8-8 after an 0-5 start earned Schottenheimer consideration as coach of the year. The coaching change was not about Schottenheimer or Spurrier. It was about Snyder regaining control of his football team. With Schottenheimer, Snyder realized that he has no input. Now he has it again. The last thing Washington needs is more change. A team can't keep changing and expect to be good. If you count the few hours Pepper Rogers was the team's head coach, this will be the Redskins' 5th head coach in 13 months. Norv Turner, Pepper Rogers, Terry Robisky, Schottenheimer, and now Spurrier. So even a guy like, Joe Theismann was really critical of the franchise that he played for in this whole sort of slipshod, bring in Steve Spurrier. And
where had Spurrier been? He'd been at Florida. Okay,
Florida.
Yeah.
And, again, we're getting into the times I really remember. And this is one where people's criticisms at the beginning ended up being exactly right. Spurrier's there for 2 years. He first tries bringing in a bunch of guys from Florida. He brings in I remember his quarterbacks were Danny Werfel, Shane Matthews, and I almost said Rex Grossman, not Danny Werfel, Shane Matthews, and what was the other? Patrick Ramsey. So 2 of those 3 guys were Florida guys. I think Ramsey was the one who wasn't, ended up being the quarterback. He came in and people at the time were saying, by the way, his defensive coordinator is Marvin Lewis. So he's got a guy who, had come fresh off of being the defensive coordinator for that Super Bowl champion Ravens team, and within a year would be a head coach of his own. And, so he's got a good assistant to run the defense, but the criticisms of him all proved to be exactly true. First was that he wasn't going to care enough about the defensive side of the ball, which, might work in college, but wasn't going to work in the NFL. The second was that he liked to spend a lot of his time golfing. And, I think there's a larger conversation to have about these NFL coaches who work 20 hours a day and don't leave the facility except for, they go have dinner with their family on Friday nights or whatever during the season. I think there's a larger conversation to have about that and how some of that can't possibly be. He comes right in and just takes a shot at Jim Haslett, the coach of the Saints, and he says something like, I saw where Jim Haslett said he sleeps in his office and works 18 hours a day. Well, that's not helping him any. The Saints ain't very good. And it's like, just right away with stuff like that. Like, I don't know, maybe you should wait till you play a game or two. You know what I mean?
The note that I have here is that he didn't know the names of some of the players, which maybe you put in an extra hour or 2 a day just to do that. And then also, and I read this and I think it's true because I read it in a couple different places. He didn't know what sleet was. And so they came out of the locker room to practice one day, and there was something falling from the sky, and he was like, "We cannot be outside in whatever this is."
That's good for a guy who's going to be coaching in the division with the Giants and Philadelphia, and playing in Washington where you get that kind of weather. Like,
yeah, I mean, I don't know if he thought it was like the Old Testament and there were frogs coming down. Like,
I'd never heard that story.
The Lord has cursed us.
So I don't want to give like short shrift to this, but just kind of recognizing the reality of time. The Spurrier thing was a disaster, but in the ways everybody assumed it would be a disaster. And after 2003, it's over for him. The couple of things on the 03 season, at the end of the 03 season, they trade Champ Bailey to Denver for Clinton Portis, which Clinton Portis would go on to, as good as he was in Denver, he would be an excellent player for the Redskins for the next, 7-8 years on some decent Redskin teams, on some bad Redskin teams. Clinton Portis would be a very, very good player and, really come to symbolize that team. '03 was also the year that for some reason they just signed a bunch of guys who'd been on the Jets for some reason. They just like I don't know why, but they went out and they
Lavernius Coles.
They picked up Lavernius Coles. They picked up the kicker John Hall. It was a couple of guys, and I can't remember exactly. Yeah, Randy Thomas, John Hall, Lavernius Coles, and Chad Morton. They got 4 Jets. Because I remember listening to WFAN and somebody called in and was like, the league should step in. And it's like, because they're signing free agents. And then the guy he goes, the Jets should go out and get Arrington. And I think it was Jody Mack was like, he's not a free agent. What do you want them to do? Just go like kidnap him and put him in their car? Like he's under contract. But yeah, so they're bad in '03. They make this big trade in the offseason, but the big story in the '04 offseason is the return of the guy we started this all with, 12 years out of football, and Joe Gibbs returns to the organization.
Real quick, is Spurrier like the first one of these college coaches who, we don't have to delve too far into this, but I feel like he was one of the first of these guys who, just totally thought they were going to kill in the NFL and just didn't.
I believe, and I did want to go back because I guess there was some controversy about whether Spurrier had been gone or not. Yeah, because a couple years later was Nick Saban with the Dolphins, and they were okay his first year, and people were like, oh, he's really going to like the next year. They were supposed to be really, really good, and it was a disaster. And that was the thing where like halfway through the year, his players wouldn't even acknowledge him in practice or anything because he was just such a like abrasive presence to them. So I don't think Spurrier was abrasive. I just think he was in over his head and was not suited to coach an NFL team under a huge microscope. There was this whole thing with, I guess Spurrier had resigned, but there was a question of at first they were working on his buyout because he had a big contract. So like the press got a hold of him and he's like, no, I've not resigned. We're working out some things with my contract. But then like later that day, there was a report he resigned and then he was denying it. And then finally the next day he was gone, but he didn't want to like give up anything contractually by saying he'd resigned or something like that. I have a thing here that said the finalists before Joe Gibbs got back into the picture were Jim Fossil, Dennis Green, and Ray Rhodes. The other thing to mention in 2004 was that before 2004, Dick Vermeil had come back in the late 90s and won a Super Bowl with the Rams after being out of football for over a decade. And Parcells had come back in '03 with the Cowboys. Now, when you look at it, he'd only been gone for like 4 seasons, but it was also seen as a big sort of guy coming back and meeting with success. So and that was just the year before. So all of that had sort of paved the way for Gibbs to do that, but also not to just come back to the team that he'd had the success with and really had never replaced him.
Yeah, and if you think about that really in any sport, I'm sure I could think of another example, but that never actually happens where they keep pining for the guy to come home and it actually happens. In fact, the closest example I can think of is something in your wheelhouse with Fran Dunphy with LaSalle. I know he hadn't coached them before, but he came back to coach when everybody thought he was retired. Usually when these guys, it's like when they wanted to bring Parcells back to the Giants in the 90s, usually they talk about it, but it never actually happened. This is one of the rare instances where it actually happens.
Yeah. So they bring Gibbs back and, for a few years, and then we'll talk about some of this stuff, they're relatively stable. In '04, they make 2 big draft picks. They draft Sean Taylor, who, we'll talk about, tragically died in just a couple of years, but, was all pro level player with the Redskins. They drafted Chris Cooley, who was a really good player at times and also became sort of a fan favorite synonymous with the franchise where, the fans might be mad at the team. They might be mad at the owners. They might, be mad at everything about the franchise, but they liked Chris Cooley. So, those were kind of signature players for them. And in 04, they went 6-10. They still really didn't have any kind of identity as a quarterback. But then in 05, they had this sort of renaissance where they made the playoffs. Mark Brunell came in as the quarterback for the Redskins. He'd been with Jacksonville. He'd been injured. And as I was looking through this 05 team, first of all, this was their last playoff win until this year. They had not won a playoff game since 05 until this year.
Almost 2 decades.
Yep. There was a game early in the season, and they started out 5-6, and then they won their last 5 to get themselves into the playoffs. But in 2000, there was a game. It was a Monday night game, and the reason I remember this is because it was the night the Giants also played the Saints on Monday night, because the hurricane had postponed things, and the Saints had to play the Giants in a Saint home game at Giant Stadium. And then the main Monday night game was Redskins-Cowboys. And really late in the game, the Cowboys were up 13-0. And a minute apart, the Redskins hit a 39-yard pass to Santana Moss for a touchdown, and then a 70-yard pass to Santana Moss for a touchdown. And I'll remember they hit like back-to-back Hail Marys a minute apart and won the game 14-13. And that's one thing I remember about the 05 Redskins. But
Gibbs beating Parcells.
Yeah, they won their last 5 games. I remember they beat the Giants on, I think, Christmas Eve, when the Giants had a chance to wrap up the division. They got into the playoffs. They beat the Buccaneers in the wild card round, and then they went to Seattle, who, as we get to this era of the Redskins, Seattle becomes a big factor for them a lot of these years. They play Seattle in the playoffs a lot, and never on the winning end. They lose 20-10, and Seattle goes on to play in the Super Bowl that year. But Gibbs is there in his second year. They have these really, really good, young talent. This was also Antonio Pierce. Oh, no, he'd been there the year before. I'm sorry. They had Clinton Portis. They had Sean Taylor. They had these Santana Moss. They looked like these really good core of guys, only to see it all, what would become a theme, just crash down to earth in 2006. They went 5-11. They didn't make the playoffs. They entered the year way over the salary cap, so they entered the offseason way over the salary cap, so they had to let LeVar Arrington go.
Arrington goes to the Giants, plays a decent half a year, and then gets hurt, and career's over.
They do make some moves in free agency. They bring in Antoine Randall, Adam Archuleta, Christian Foria, but it also is the beginning of the Jason Campbell era for the Redskins
at quarterback.
But they finished, I think, 6-10, 5-11. They finished in last. They're really bad. All the momentum from the year before had kind of gone away. In 2007, they get to the wild card round. They finish 9-7. But this year is sort of the thing you have to talk about with this year was this was the year where in the middle of the season, Sean Taylor was shot and killed during the year.
He's home in Florida recovering from an injury, and it's like a home invasion, right?
Yeah, so he had been injured, and I guess he was out. He wasn't on injured reserve or anything. He was out for a couple of weeks, and he was November 26th, 2007. Taylor heard noises, and while investigating the cause, was shot in the leg. His femoral artery was severed, rushed to the hospital, died the following day. 4 men were arrested. At least one of them confessed. They were charged with second-degree murder. I don't know if they've given a reason for it. I mean, they say it was a burglary, and there was certainly some people made some because Sean Taylor had some legal problems, at the University of Miami. But I mean, you look back and it's like he got a DWI, which again, I'm not excusing or making light of. He'd been arrested he pled no contest to battery and assault charges. So he'd been in a few legal issues. So naturally, people jumped right to what did he do to get himself killed? You know what I mean? And, as the details of it come out, it's like, well, it was a home invasion. Now, the larger story around that, who knows? But the fact is he was an NFL player in his fourth season, was dealing with a relatively minor injury. It's not like it was going to be career threatening or even season threatening. And he is murdered in his home in the middle of the season.
Yeah, and you hate to say it like this, but he was a good player too. He'd been a Pro Bowler the year before. Now he's a Pro Bowler in 2007, but I think a lot of that is done as like a sentiment type thing. But guy had a lot of promise.
Yeah, and this obviously is tough on the team in the middle of the season. The Redskins, I'll remember they played the Bill, and this is kind of tough because of what happened in this game. But the first Redskin game after Taylor's death was against the Bills, December 2nd. Redskins are in a playoff hunt. They started the game with 10 men on the field, and they let up like a 60-yard touchdown. So like what was supposed to be like a memorial to him and not having a guy on the field on defense kind of burned them because the Bills scored a long touchdown on the play.
Yeah, I got to say, too, teams just shouldn't do that. Like, I understand what you're saying, but, they're still – I mean, I guess they made the playoffs anyway, but, like, you're in a playoff fight. Like, what benefit is there to that? It's just – I don't know. It's like half a step away from throwing the game.
Well, and this game was also the game that they lost. They lost this game because the Bills were lining up to kick a field goal, and the Redskins took a second straight timeout, which led to a 15-yard unsportsmanlike conduct penalty and moved it from like a 52-yarder to a 37-yarder or something like that. And the Bills ended up winning the game 17-16. Now, after that, the Redskins won their last four games over Chicago, the Giants, Minnesota, and Dallas, and managed to get themselves into the playoffs by winning those four games. But, that was, I remember being like, that's a tough way to lose in that situation with everything that happened to lose that game like that.
Yeah, no question.
So,
all right. So you all didn't hear that, or you won't hear it, but Andrew and I just kind of made an on-the-fly decision. And Andrew, why don't you fill the audience in?
Yeah, so we'll wrap up 2007 here. They finished 9-7 on that 4-game win streak, like I mentioned. They get to the wild card game. I remember where we were because we were. That was the next week. They lose on a Saturday night. They lose to Seattle. I was thinking of Seattle's next game. I was flying home from Florida. They actually have a lead 14-13 early in the fourth quarter, and I remember rooting hard for them in this game because they were the number 6 seed. And if they won, that meant if the Giants beat the Bucs the next day, the Giants could avoid the Cowboys. And at the time, I wanted the Giants to avoid the Cowboys. So I remember rooting pretty hard for Washington that day. Ultimately, Seattle pulled ahead of them. They were up 14-13 in the fourth quarter, and then there was 2 pick sixes, and they ended up losing 35-14. So it looked like a blowout. But at the end of that year, Gibbs has been back 4 years. They make the playoffs twice. They win a playoff game. They still don't win a division title. They're not.
I think. Is Gibbs there 4 years or only 3?
4. 04, 05, 06, 07.
Oh, I didn't realize he was there in 04 too. Okay.
The years I was in college. Okay. I remember that. So Spurrier was there 02, 03. So after the 07 season, pretty quickly, I think while the playoffs are still going on, Gibbs announces he's done again. And to date, he's stayed done. Has he passed away?
He has not passed away. I think there were also some health issues. I think his grandson had some
That
health
sounds
issues,
right,
so
yeah.
there was that too.
So Gibbs announces he's stepping aside, and you know, there's a sense kind of like, what did it prove? I mean, I guess from a nostalgia standpoint, it was good if you're a fan that you got him back. And yeah, they made 2 playoffs, but I don't know if going into it's not like he built this team that was set up to last. So I guess it was better than what else would have happened for 4 years. And especially if you're a younger generation, like if you just missed him, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You got to see him when you were maybe in your 20s or something. Like I could see where that would be really cool, but it's not like it was this overwhelming success story. They had some nice pieces. They made a couple of playoff runs, but wild cards, divisional round one time. So Gibbs steps aside at the end of the 07 season. And once again, they're in a coaching search, just keeping track since Snyder's taken over and not counting interim coaches. He had Norv Turner. Yeah, he had Norv Turner. He had who he inherited, but he had for a season and a half. He had Marty Schottenheimer for a year. He had Steve Spurrier for 2 years. Now he's had Joe Gibbs for 4 years. Now Stan Snyder didn't fire Joe Gibbs, but Joe Gibbs is gone. So he's now looking for full-time head coach number 5 in his era. And what I think we're going to do is leave this part here, and then we'll do 08 until the present day in another episode, which may be a little quicker, but just as a preview of this stuff we're going to talk about in the second part. So you have the Jim Zorn era, so to speak, 08 and 09. You're going to have Mike Shanahan. You're going to have Jay Gruden. You're going to have Ron Rivera. You're going to have the ultimate selling of the team by Daniel Snyder, which is probably where we'll basically end. You're also going to have and we talked at the beginning, but the culmination of the name controversy with them finally changing the name a couple of times. To me, the linchpin of what kind of will tie the next part together is the meteoric rise and then just as abrupt fall of the Robert Griffin era in Washington, the RG3 era. And that was kind of what led us to wanting to do this as 2 parts, because I feel like we need to do that justice. And to do that justice is going to require a little bit of time. And we didn't want to make this episode 3.5 hours long, but we also didn't want to speed through 15 years of it in 20 minutes.
One thing I would note, and maybe I'll say this again at the top of the next episode, you talk about them hiring Jim Zorn. That's a change in that the 3 previous coaching hires have really been intended to be big splashes, right? Schottenheimer, big deal. Spurrier, college coach, big deal. And then obviously bringing Gibbs back. So maybe going into 2009, if you're a Redskins fan, you could be forgiven for thinking that things aren't going to be quite so nutty, but they still say plenty nutty over the next 15 or so years.
Yeah. So, there'll be plenty to talk about in the second part.
Well, we look forward to catching up with you all for part 2, but this was part 1. It was a good one, and we will catch you in part 2. But until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website, seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.